You have the unfettered right to decide if you wear a piece of cloth, otherwise known as a mask, over your mouth in public. You even get to decide if you want to get a COVID-19 vaccine. But if you live in the state of Texas and you are a woman, the government, not you, makes the decision over your body and whether you carry a baby to term. How can this red state deny women such a fundamental right, given the Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade and its progeny? And what are advocates doing to fight back against this attack? Experts weigh in, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
On May 19, 2021, Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed into law the so-called heartbeat law that would prohibit abortions in the state as early as 6 weeks. This is one of the most restrictive abortion laws in the country. The law circumvents the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade and 50 years of precedent that established that women have a fundamental right to privacy, which includes the right to make decisions over their bodies and, more specifically, their reproductive rights. Opponents of the Texas law filed an emergency petition to prevent the law from going into effect. The Supreme Court, in a stunning one-paragraph order, refused to block the law and allowed it to go into effect on September 1, effectively ending most abortions in the state of Texas. The decision sparked nationwide outrage from women and advocates and even the White House. The president promised a whole of government approach to restore women's rights. The U.S. Department of Justice sued the state of Texas, and just last night, the Department of Justice asked a federal court to issue an order that would prevent Texas from enacting Senate Bill 8. The DOJ's filing argues that the Texas law prevents women from exercising their constitutional rights. The Department of Justice asked the court to issue a temporary restraining order that would prevent the law's enforcement. In the meantime, over 90% of Texas abortion clinics have closed their doors, leaving thousands of women without access to reproductive health services. Black, brown, and poor women are the ones who will suffer the most. Here for my leadoff discussion is Reverend Dr. Leah Shade. She is a professor at Lexington Theological Seminary and a returning guest to the Special Report. Good morning and welcome back to the show, Reverend Shade.
Thank you, Areva. It's great to be back with you again.
Yeah, there's so many things wrong with this Texas abortion law, Senate Bill 8, from not providing any exceptions for rape and incest, and from weaponizing individual citizens throughout the state to literally become bounty hunters, as it relates to trying to enforce this law. But I want to ask you about the clergy. You've been outspoken on so many issues that are important to people, particularly progressives, from voting rights to social justice causes around police brutality. What is the clergy saying about Senate Bill 8?
Well, I have to say, not much. My research has shown that most progressive clergy are not talking about abortion issues. I conducted research over the past 4 years. I did a survey in 2017 and one this year asking clergy what topics they talk about in their sermons. And the majority of clergy who are progressive do not address abortion issues in their sermons. Only 10% said that they had talked about it in their preaching. Now that's compared with 20% of conservative clergy, and those who are looking ahead. One of the questions was, what do you intend to talk about? Conservative clergy said 30% of them said that they are intending to address it. So I would make the case that one of the factors contributing to conservatives having power and enacting this kind of restrictive legislation against reproductive rights in Texas, and there's other states where this is happening, has been the relative silence of progressive clergy on progressive issues compared with their conservative peers.
And help us understand why it is, if you know from your research or your survey, why conservative clergy feel empowered to talk about abortion. And we know when they talk about it, they talk about restricting women's rights to abortions versus progressive clergy who have, for the most part, based on your research, remained relatively silent. What's the difference?
Well, for conservatives, it boils down to an oversimplified talking point of protecting the life of the unborn child, when in reality, it's much more multifaceted and nuanced. Clergy, progressive clergy, often won't touch this topic with a 10-foot pulpit because it has to do with sex, it has to do with philosophical and ethical issues like when does life begin? At conception, fetal heartbeat, viable outside the womb. It's a difficult conversation to have. But the thing is, it's also about the lives of women and girls who are often faced with horrendous dilemmas. And these dilemmas often are due to sexual violence. Sometimes it has to do with medical issues for the mother or the fetus. And there are decisions about reproductive rights that touch on relationships, power differentials, race, poverty, wealth, access to healthcare, and family dynamics. So it's not something that is very easy to talk about, but I want to make the case that because progressive clergy have not addressed this hardly at all, that space has been filled with these more strident voices that are calling for this kind of restrictive legislation.
Have you been able to determine that within progressive clergy circles, if there's any, consensus about what you just raised? You raised the issue about, when does, life begin? And we know that when you talk to or listen to conservative clergy and conservative legislators, for them, it begins literally after the Sex Act. But for progressive clergy, is there any consensus about when life begins?
I don't think there is. The Bible actually has different ideas of when life begins. A lot of times people will bring out the Jeremiah passage where God says to Jeremiah, I knew you before you were informed in the womb. So indicating that life begins even before conception. But in, of course, the story of Genesis, Adam doesn't become a living being until the breath moves into the body. So, when the baby is able to take breath, is that when life happens? But I think that there are other questions that are more important actually than these, because what we're seeing is this kind of law not only is restricting women, but it is going to restrict the work that pastors themselves can do. Because under the law, any person who successfully sues an abortion provider or anyone who aids a woman to obtain an abortion can be awarded $10,000. So
Right.
that means that a pastor in Texas who counsels a woman who decides to obtain an abortion could potentially be sued. So you could imagine a disgruntled parishioner or anyone in the community snitching on the pastor, accusing them of aiding and abetting a woman to obtain an abortion without a proof. So this is not just about the question of when life begins. This is about how we're going to live together in community. How are we going to pastor people who are often faced with these very difficult decisions if we can't even have the conversation?
And that's why I asked you the question about consensus around when life begins, because I wanted you to respond and bring to light the point that it's you can support women's reproductive rights and their right to make choices over their bodies without getting into a debate or coming to some ultimate conclusion about when life begins, because no one has a monopoly on when life begins. And if you can talk to 10 different doctors, you can talk to 10 different scientists, and you'll get 10 different answers. And likewise, you can listen to 10 different pastors preach or, interpret what they believe to be the passages in the Bible that say that abortion is wrong, and you get 10 different responses. So how do we get progressive clergy to understand you don't have to get into, the battle over when life begins, because that's not necessarily a winnable battle, to understand the importance of supporting women and their rights to reproductive health?
Exactly. What I would advocate, and I will say, when I was serving as a pastor in a church, this was not something that I talked about, because I wasn't trained in seminary about how to have these conversations. We're not really equipped to have this. But if I were going to suggest to pastors what to do, I would first of all let your leadership know that you want to have this conversation, so it's not coming as a surprise. And I would say, if you're going to preach about it, don't just preach and then just sit down and that's it, but really invite people into a dialogue and education about it. So it's not just about whether we should or we should not, but how do we have the conversation? That's a really important question. Because the other thing that I think needs to be lifted up here is that with these laws, we need to notice that there is a double standard. These laws are about regulating the contested space of a woman's body, but there are no laws that regulate a man's body when it comes to reproductive rights. And we need to talk about that kind of disparity and why that is.
No, that's a really, really important point. And I think that point gets lost on so many people. Even women who tend to support these laws is not being honest about the inequality and the way that these laws oppress women and deny women equal rights and rights that we fought for. And I don't understand how people can be, for equal rights, equal pay for women, but yet, deny women the sole control over their reproductive health and rights as it relates to their bodies. Help us, Reverend Shade, for those people who often find themselves in debates with family members or friends about what the Bible says about abortion. Help us understand from your perspective and from a progressive clergy perspective what the Bible does and doesn't say about abortion.
It's interesting that you would bring this up. Most people don't know that there is actually a passage in the book of Numbers, which is in the Old Testament, that not only authorizes the priest to induce a woman to have an abortion in case she has been unfaithful to her husband, but even gives the recipe for this secret formula. So the way this works is in Numbers chapter 5, if a husband suspects his wife of being unfaithful, he can bring her to the priest, and the priest can make this concoction of bitter water. And if she's innocent, everything will be fine. But if she has conceived, this special concoction is supposed to make her miscarry. So the Bible itself does talk about abortion and actually has a recipe for it. Most people don't recognize that. So it's much more, the Bible doesn't have one position on abortion. It's got lots of different stories about life and living in community and women and women's rights or lack thereof and how we treat women. And it's worth having that discussion as well. But we have to put aside our squeamishness and be able to engage in these conversations forthrightly so that we don't leave a space for these other voices that are insisting on controlling women's bodies and their reproductive rights in a very draconian way.
And help us understand then, what are the arguments often used by anti-abortion clergy? What passages do they typically cite in the Bible? And help us understand, how they are misguided in citing those passages. But they often, conservative clergy often, refer to the Bible as well.
Right. So the passage I mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 1, before you were in the womb, I knew you. Psalm 139, I hemmed you in the womb. So the idea that God has a relationship with the unborn child, which is beautiful. That's not a bad thing. But it's important to understand that the Bible speaks in metaphor. The Bible was never meant to be taken literally. It speaks about divine things that are very difficult for human beings in our limited capacity to understand. So metaphor is used. So if we try to take all of these things literally to say, okay, it's from the time of conception, then we might be misusing the text in a way that furthers our ideological agenda. So I think it's important to when we're talking about these things, these are about individual women's and couples and families' lives. Trying to do a whole universal legislation is going to do a lot of damage, as you pointed out. All of these abortion clinics that have already closed are going to disproportionately hurt those who can least afford to seek out abortions elsewhere, because they're going to happen no matter what. But they're not going to be as safe, and the people who do not have access to them are going to be doubly burdened.
Well, thank you so much, Reverend Shea, for joining us. I know you wrote a very thoughtful piece on this whole topic, hopefully encouraging your fellow men and women who are progressive clergy to begin this dialogue and to start talking about this. So, as you said, this void isn't just filled with one voice. I wish we would see more courageous pastors like yourself speaking out about these issues and trying to help people, because I know I talk to a lot of Christians myself. I'm a Christian, and even Christians sometimes grapple with this notion of, protecting women's reproductive rights, because they themselves may have been in a church, a very conservative church, or had a conservative pastor, and they've been led to believe that there are these, hard and fast rules in the Bible that speak against abortions. So we definitely need more folks like you enlightening us, educating us, and helping us even as Christians understand how we can both be a good Christian and support the reproductive rights of women.
Thank you. Yeah, that article, by the way, is on pathos.com. And I'll just say it's time for seminaries, denominations, clergy, and churches to address this issue.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And thank you for the work that you do. And always a pleasure to see you.
Great to be with you, Areva.
All right, we're talking about that restrictive Texas abortion law. It's called Senate Bill 8. We've talked about the clergy's response to the bill. My next guest is a staff attorney for the ACLU based in Houston, Texas, and he is one of the lawyers that's been involved in fighting the Texas restrictive abortion bill. His name is David Donati, and welcome, David. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. So many questions about this new law, the Texas Abortion Act. I guess it's called the Texas Heartbeat Act. Help us first understand, when did this law, I guess it's Senate Bill 8, go into effect?
So this law went into effect earlier this month, September 1st, and we've been fighting it for a couple of months before that, but it was passed in a legislative session earlier this year. And we've started to see the effects of it in Texas as of this month.
And so it goes into effect September 1. Give us that little brief history about what was happening at the lower courts before we saw that petition that was filed with the U.S. Supreme Court.
So we filed a lawsuit in federal court challenging this Fetal Heartbeat Act back in July of this year to try and get it's called an injunction, but blocking the law from taking an effect. And we filed the case against a number of people, state officials, against a private person who was very likely to sue under this law, as well as state judges and the state clerks who would enforce the law. And we had moved for what we call summary judgment, which is we need you to declare this law flat out unconstitutional, because it's purely a legal question. In the United States, can you ban abortion at 6 weeks of pregnancy? And every court to ever consider that question has said no, definitively. So we moved for that kind of judgment. But because of the pushback that we got from the defendants in this case and from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, we moved for an emergency injunction, a preliminary injunction. And we were scheduled and ready for a hearing on it August 30th. The district court judge gave us 6 hours of evidence between the both sides, 2 hours of legal argument. We were preparing our witnesses. And then at the last minute, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals intervened It took away jurisdiction from the district court, and it's held the case ever since.
And so, was it the ACLU in Houston that actually filed an emergency petition with the U.S. Supreme Court to have them review the decision by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals?
It was. We're part of an amazing team that includes the Center for Reproductive Rights, Planned Parenthood, the Lawyering Project, as well as a private law firm, Morrison and Forster. So we couldn't have done this without our amazing team. But we've been involved at every step of this federal litigation.
So that team of lawyers that you just talked about and group of advocates file a emergency petition with the U.S. Supreme Court asking them basically to stay the action by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And we know, we've seen the news, we've heard the headlines. The Supreme Court, in like a one paragraph unsigned decision, basically refuses to do so, and by making that decision, essentially sanctions this fetal heartbeat law. Where does the case stand now, David?
Absolutely. So we exist in what I would call a kind of legal purgatory, where no court has yet to hear the legal merits of our case, even though it's so well established that it's unconstitutional. The Supreme Court, 5-4 in a one paragraph opinion, allowed the law to take effect. And then the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has really just held on to it without further action on its part to allow us to really ventilate the issues at stake. And so for the past 2 weeks now, we've had abortion banned in the state of Texas. And it's a result of judicial inaction.
Mm-hmm. So let me just make sure my viewers understand, because the Fifth Circuit is just kind of holding the case, you can't go forward with that previously scheduled hearing, that evidentiary hearing where you're going to present witnesses and evidence. All that's just on hold at this point.
That's exactly right. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals actually divested the district court of jurisdiction over the case while it has authority over it.
So have you all, and you being the lawyer, the legal team, filed anything with the Fifth Circuit trying to, get them to take some action or to move the case forward in any way?
So where we are with the Fifth Circuit now is they have committed to give us at least an argument at the next opportunity, which is not likely to be before October. So for the month of September, at least as far as the Fifth Circuit is concerned, we're not able to take further action on the case. That doesn't mean we won't. We're gonna try. We're gonna do everything we can to keep fighting.
And based on what you know, David, so Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals will schedule some oral arguments. You'll present your argument. The other side will present its argument. And presumably this goes back up to the Supreme Court. Is that what you expect will happen?
Absolutely. Yes, I think that this case needs to be in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. And that is the role that the U.S. Supreme Court has played in these cases in the past. And so that is the end of the train for us.
It's so hard, David, for people to understand. Roe v. Wade has not been overturned. So
right.
It's still good law. It's still the prevailing state of the law on abortions or women's rights to reproductive health in this country. But yet the Texas legislatures were able to enact this very restrictive 6-week ban. Help us understand how they kind of deviously skirted the constitutional issues that are raised and affirmed in the Roe decision.
Areva, that's one of the most heartbreaking facts about this entire scenario, which is the right to abortion in the United States is a fundamental right. It is the core right to bodily integrity, to make choices about our health care, about things that should be between a patient and their doctor. And the Supreme Court has never said otherwise. That is what we call black letter law. It is just well established. Yeah. And here, what you have is the Supreme Court saying, sure, it's a fundamental right. But because of the way Texas has designed this law, we're just going to allow it to take effect. And the effect is that fundamental right is not as good as the paper that it's written on in the state of Texas. And so the ingenuity, the evil genius of this law is that Texas could never have done what it has done here by itself. It couldn't have criminalized abortion and said, hey, every district attorney, every prosecutor, go prosecute patients who receive abortions or providers. It just could not have done that. And so what it has done is it has said, anti-abortion activists who helped us write this law, you can go ahead and do it, and we'll just keep our hands clean of it. And so by delegating that enforcement authority to private parties who we know are politically inclined, but even more than that, just anyone who wants to scoop up a $10,000 bounty, they can now do what the Constitution forbids. And so what is heartbreaking about it is that we have this fundamental right, and the courts are just turning a blind eye to it. And I think that there's really no limitation to the logic or lack of logic that's at stake here.
Help us understand, has the legislature ever done anything like this before, where they enact a law but delegate enforcement of that law not to the state prosecutors or the district attorneys and counties throughout Texas, but gives that right to individual citizens, like you said, anyone, anti-abortion activist, a man that's upset with a woman, a rapist even, because there's no exception for rape or incest in this law. Has there ever been any law enacted in Texas that does this?
Nothing like this at all. So the closest analogy is, you're probably familiar with what are called private attorneys general provisions. And so that is, we can help the federal government enforce labor laws or anti-corruption laws and federal contracting. But one big difference between all of those situations and what's at stake here is that in those cases, the federal government can also enforce labor laws. They can also enforce anti-bribery statutes. Here, the state of Texas, because it doesn't want to go to court, has said we can't enforce this at all. So the way SB 8 is written is it says there is a criminal ban on abortion in the state of Texas, but we're not going to enforce it. We're just going to let activists in and of themselves and only them do it. And the only function of that throwing up their hands is so that people can't go to court and challenge this law and get their day in court.
And because it's a criminal ban, so the civil piece means, again, some vindictive person finds out that you're planning to get an abortion. I'm just trying to walk through the steps in terms of how this works. They then can go into your civil court system, file some kind of action. Now, is that an injunction where that person who's filing that action is also getting an injunction preventing the person from getting, from having the abortion?
That's absolutely right. So the way that the law is written is any person, and it doesn't even say you have to be in Texas. It says any person can sue, and they can sue where they are if they're in the state of Texas. So I'm here in Houston. Someone can sue me in El Paso, which is a 13-hour drive away and still in the state of Texas. And under this law, I have to defend in El Paso. And what happens when they sue is not only can they get $10,000 mandatory minimum statutory penalty, so it could be more money than that, but they also get an injunction preventing the abortion from taking place. And they can also get attorney's fees, which could be tremendous and additional. And the law does all sorts of additional sinister things to limit the defenses that people can make, to force them to defend in venues that are inconvenient to them. It really is just designed to prevent abortions from happening in the state of Texas, isolate patients, and violate fundamental rights.
Are there any criminal penalties? I mean, is the person who's seeking the abortion, are they subject to any criminal penalties?
So no, the law does not contain any criminal penalties for people receiving abortions. And what we would say is that abortion is still legal for patients in the state of Texas. The sinister effect of this Fetal Heartbeat Act is that the right exists, but you've just isolated patients and made it impossible for them to get it. So it's really no right at all.
And we understand, David, from reporting that 90%, if not more, of the abortion clinics and providers in the state of Texas have pretty much ceased to operate. Is that
That's
right?
absolutely right. Yes. So even there is a very small number of providers who will provide abortions before that magic 6-week mark. But just to be very clear about what that 6-week means, it's 6 weeks after your last menstrual period. So really, if you miss a menstrual cycle, you have 2 weeks to identify that you're pregnant and then make that decision about whether to carry that pregnancy to term. And obviously, it's much more complicated than that. So some people who make that decision in time will be able to access care out of state. They can hop on a flight and get it. But for low-income Texans, the majority of whom are people of color, that is just not an opportunity for them. So it really does eliminate the ability to fit in that window. And even for people within that window, several providers have just determined it's too risky. It's too risky to provide care under these very narrow circumstances and for the very small number of patients who make it in time.
So we know, David, lawyers are very creative. And just like the bunch that came up with this devious plan to circumvent the traditional, state enforcement provisions that are usually in a law, we've heard the president say he's going to take a whole of government approach. He's empowered the attorney general to, try to find creative ways. We know that the Department of Justice actually sued the state of Texas. Help us understand what are we to make of the federal lawsuit that's now been filed against the state of Texas? And do you have a lot of hope that that's going to in some way prevent or, de-incentivize these individuals that might otherwise have, gone out and filed these lawsuits trying to get this $10,000 bounty?
So hope has kind of been beaten out of me a little bit, but I have to keep believing that there is something that can be done. And we're extremely grateful to the federal government for becoming involved. And they've actually collaborated with us. They filed in our court in the Western District of Texas, and they related their case to ours, and we've been working together with them. And to the extent that we can find any optimism, I think it is simply the very fact that the federal government weighing in here, which adds so much visibility to this issue, and it really does tip the scales. So I don't think that disincentivizes anybody from suing under this law. I think the rules of engagement are pretty well defined. And what anti-abortion activists in Texas would say is, until I have a binding order from the Supreme Court, I'm going to proceed as SB 8 in the state of Texas allow me to do. And I think that they've been very clear about that. So the end game remains the same. It is, can we get a binding federal court decision, either from the district court, court of appeals, or Supreme Court, that says that this law is unconstitutional? And that is really what we're fighting for.
So I know the federal government, was relying on, in part on this 1994 Act, this FACE Act, this Freedom of Access to Clinic Interest Act that was really enacted when, clinic providers were under physical attack, actually being beaten and being, killed for providing abortion services. How hopeful are you that that provision or some aspect of that law is going to save the day in this case?
I think that it is perhaps it's one of several arguments the federal government has made is what I'll say about it. And so I think the strongest one, which is the one that we really led on, is this is a fundamental right. And it just cannot be that a state can violate a fundamental right and get away with it. And the federal government has made that claim, and it is led with that claim, and it's very strong about it. But in addition, the federal government has listed a number of different interests that it has in terms of its federal prerogatives, in terms of what the Department of Defense can do, in terms of what it can do through Medicaid. And I think all of those are perfectly viable reasons why the state of Texas shouldn't be allowed to regulate out of existence this fundamental right, especially not in a way that is more restrictive than the federal government has done here. But I do think we are hoping, and we are really pushing the most forcefully on the fact that this is just a fundamental right, and it cannot be the case that a state can just identify a right that it wants to get rid of, ban the practice of that right, and then delegate that to private parties.
Well, thank you so much, David, for the work, again, that you're doing, that the ACLU is doing, that those private firms and those organizations are doing. We're definitely going to keep an eye on this, and hopefully you'll get back before that Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal, and we'll be watching what the Department of Justice does in terms of its filing of emergency injunctive relief. But again, thanks for your work, and thanks for sitting down with me this morning.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
My next guest is Dr. Joya Creer-Perry. She's a physician, she's a policy expert, and founder and president of the National Birth Equity Collaborative. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Creer-Perry.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know what's happening on the ground in Texas. We know that this law, most restrictive abortion law in the country, impacts all women. But we also know that women who get abortions are disproportionately low income, young, Black, and Latina. I read a statistic that says Black women have the highest abortion rates at 27.1% per, or 27.1 per 1,000 women. So help us understand the impact of this Texas abortion law on Black and brown women.
Well, we know that the irony is the language is always that we're here to protect individuals, but for Black women and Black birthing people and the people with the capacity for pregnancy, this law is the opposite of protection. It says we need bodily control. We have the highest rates of maternal mortality in the country, in the world. The United States has some of the highest rates in the world, and yet we're doing things like restricting people's access. So one of the reasons that Black women have these high rates is because we are not protected. We don't have access to equal pay, paid leave, childcare services, the things that you need, the social structures one needs in order to form families. So in addition to not investing in these social structures for Black birthing people in Texas, we're then also saying we're going to punish you if you make choices for yourself to ensure that you're safe and that your family is safe. So this is actually adding insult to injury. This is it's an ugly law. It's a mean-spirited law. Having people who are vigilantes and empowering them for $10,000 to go after folks. We know that this will not go well for people who've already been deemed, who have been treated poorly as people of Black people of African descent have been treated in this country, and especially in Texas.
You are a physician, Dr. Career Perry, and oftentimes people don't think of abortion care as a part of health care or reproductive health care. Help us disabuse people of that notion.
Well, it's part of I'm an OBGYN. It's part of the general training of obstetrics and gynecology to be able to perform abortion services. The full range of reproduction options go from infertility, fertility, access to sex education. So we cannot separate one part of our reproductive being. In fact, we know that the mother of the movement, Coretta Scott, died from ovarian cancer. This is in Mexico, because we have not invested in the research that one needs around even the tumors that occur for women, for people of color. So when we don't use the word abortion, when we don't talk about it in the context of healthcare, we're ignoring all the other parts of sex and reproduction that this country has commodified and not utilized and not seen as our ability to really thrive and be invested in fully. So abortion is healthcare, just as infertility services are healthcare, just as access to treatment for fibroids and ovarian cancer is healthcare, and all of these things in a country with as much wealth and resources as the United States should be invested in for all people, especially people who've been historically disenfranchised and not invested in.
I want to bring into the conversation now Loretta Ross. She's a professor at Smith College, and she's the co-founder of Sister Song. Good morning, Professor Ross.
Thanks for having me on your show.
Oh, you're welcome. I wanted to have you and Dr. Career Perry on together because it seems like at a time when Black women are calling for reproductive justice, a term that Sister Song coined, we see this Texas law and see states that are going to use this Texas law as a playbook in terms of getting similar laws enacted in their own states. Where are we, Professor, with respect to reproductive justice, particularly for Black women?
Well, you have to see this attack on abortion rights as part of a larger anti-democratic effort. I think isolating abortion from the racial and gender and anti-immigration policies and really the anti-democratic policies of Republicans would be a mistake. As a matter of fact, we Black women have always offered a critique of a brand of feminism that didn't include a racial justice analysis so that you could understand the disproportionate impact certain restrictions had on different populations. And so reproductive justice, just to put simply, is the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to raise your children in safe and healthy environments. And so we see this actually as a feint. Of course, the impact is going to disproportionately fall on low-income women, primarily Black and brown women, but it's also about compelling white women to have more babies. This is not a state that wants more brown and Black babies. This is a state that wants more white babies. And so failure to include a racial analysis into the ideology behind this law, as opposed to just its impact, is what we critique some of the feminist movement for failing to do.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up. So I spent Monday on the show talking to Mickey Kendall. She wrote Hood Feminism, New York Times bestselling book. And one of the things that Mickey said was that white feminists have not been standing with Black women on these issues of maternal death rates. And we know Texas, Dr. Career Perry, has one of the most dangerous places in the developed world to be pregnant due to its high maternal death rates. Have you seen the white women, feminists in particular, who have been outspoken against this Texas abortion law? Are they speaking out against these horrific, high maternal death rates?
This is really the crux of where we've had this fight, and I'm proud to continue the tradition that Loretta and others have started for us and really try to lean in and hold that you cannot have an analysis around reproductive justice or even around abortion without understanding anti-Blackness, without understanding racism. The folks who put together this law in Texas also do voter laws around decreasing voter engagement. They also do laws around not having access to immigration. And so when our colleagues who are very, very well-meaning white feminists can't see the need for unrooting racism as the core of why people are fighting to have access to fighting against choice, when people can't see that that is a core tenet, that you never have a march that is anti-choice without having people there who are also anti-Black. They are hand in hand. They are one thing. So I think what I'm learning in my journey on this, with this work and in this movement, is that when people also devalued Black people themselves, even though they are also feminists, they cannot see the harm that that causes. And so really unlearning the anti-Blackness inside the feminist movement is going to be so important for us to be able to really move forward and fully embrace the reproductive justice movement that Loretta and others started.
And Professor Ross, you said something that a lot of people may be shocked to hear, that a lot of these anti-abortion laws is really about making sure more white babies are born and fewer Black and brown babies. Is that from you've been in this a long time, so your work in this movement, is that really motivating some of these legislators, these Republican legislators around the country?
Well, of course, if you pay any attention to their overblown demographic fears, they're of course concerned that white people will become a minority in this country among other minorities by about the middle of the century, and they only have a few options. Well, one of them is to reduce the number of citizens who aren't white, which they're doing with immigration restrictions and withdrawing even the citizenship status of people who have already attained citizenship. They also can try to persuade white women to have more babies, which they're failing to do because white women are too educated to go for that barefoot and pregnant narrative that they're trying to do. Or they can redefine who is included in the definition of whiteness. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to see a lot of white passing inclusion now. Mm-hmm. I think particularly affecting the Asian American and the Latino populations. And so this is that strategy of trying to compel white women to do, kind of in the Handmaid's Tale thing, that they wouldn't do voluntarily. Because if you cut off access to sex education, evidence-based information, access to abortion, access to birth control, you get only one outcome. And that's a lot of ill-informed young kids engaging in sexual activity with no information, with no protection, and with no options. The only part of America where the teen pregnancy rate continues to rise is in the parts of America where they have abstinence-based education, a strong religious culture, and they're predominantly among white children. This is the outcome that they want, and we're seeing evidence of it in our research, and unfortunately, in the uptick of people desperately calling us for help.
Yeah, that's disheartening about this law in states like Texas that won't allow schools to even teach about sex education and talk about contraceptives in ways that young kids and girls in particular can protect themselves. And then on the back end, tell them if you do get pregnant, you must have this child. Dr. Perry, we hear a lot of conservative talking points about responsibility. Well, you wouldn't need an abortion if you took personal responsibility. You wouldn't need an abortion if you weren't careless and if you weren't actually having sex. How do you respond to some of those comments that attempt to place this issue on place them at the feet of these women who are now being prevented from exercising their fundamental rights?
Well, we have a long history and legacy of blaming and shaming all kind of health outcomes on women, especially on Black women. We blame, it's so bad that even during the pandemic, there was a state senator in Ohio who said the reason that it was passing is because people weren't washing their hands and they weren't as cleanly, even though we have data that shows Black women are generally more cleanly. We've been cleaning up people's houses. We've been washing other people's clothes. And so this idea, this narrative of blaming and shaming us in order to continue to have power and control is really important. And to build upon what the professor was just saying, Dr. Ross was just saying, we know even the CDC releases every year the replacement rate by race of each individual. So in order to replace your race Every person with the capacity of pregnancy in the United States needs to have 2.1 children per capacity. And the fact is, every year the CDC says, oh, white women, you are not replacing yourselves. Your number is low. And oh, Black and brown women, your number is too high. We codify racism even in how we're collecting data through the Centers of Disease Control. How can it be scientifically relevant, the number of children that a person should have to replace their race if there were no white supremacy? How would it even matter? So to the point around, this is really a tool to try to control the narrative of what the dominant infrastructure of this country is around white supremacy. That's all this always has ever been. And that's why if we don't honor that and claim that and put that out front in the conversations, we keep having this circular, well, why is Texas making this law? Why is Mississippi making this law? We already know why they're making this law. There's a desire to keep white supremacy in place. There's a desire for eugenics to still hold, and that keeps happening over and over again. It's not just about my body, my choice. It's about power.
Yeah, that power dynamic is so important. And you're right. I mean, to think that they are keeping data on how quickly the white race is being replaced and through that data collection process, realizing that we are growing too quickly. Black and brown people are just populating this country at a rate that is outpacing white women, and that's a problem.
But I also wanted to talk about the deaths of despair amongst the white population too.
Go ahead.
Because they're suiciding, they're committing mass murders, they're allowing their children to be gunned down in these these mass school shootouts. So it's not only about the number of births, it's about the deaths due to gun violence, to the opioid addiction, and all of those. Those things are colliding to reduce the white population. It's not our fault, but they like blaming us.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Professor Ross. I also want to talk about the Fugitive Slave Acts. We've seen a lot of advocates come out and say that this Texas abortion law is reminiscent of the Fugitive Slave Act, where Black people were traumatized. They were afraid of being, tracked down and charged with violating the slave codes. Do you see elements of that in this Texas abortion law?
Yeah,
I'm a Texan. I was born in Temple, Texas. And so we have this romanticized culture about vigilante justice and all of that. And that's the long history of a state of which I wish I could be proud. That is baked into the culture, that you're supposed to take the law into your own hands. And of course, we invented Juneteenth in Texas because the news of the Emancipation Proclamation was withheld from us for 2 years. And so that is part of the culture of Texas is full of obnoxious people like me. I mean, we're trained to be obnoxious in relationship to the rest of the world. For the first 10 years you're in school, they only teach you Texas history. And then in the 11th grade, they say, oh, there's the United States. And in the 12th grade, they take, and there's the rest of the world. But we know what you know is the most important is that Texas is the center of the world. And so, yes, the Fugitive Slave Act is a parallel, the denial of of the Emancipation Proclamation, the vigilante culture that created the Texas Rangers, that mass murdered Mexican Americans and Native Americans. All of that is in the mix of a state that refuses to concede that the Civil War was lost.
Yeah, Professor Ross, I thought only New Yorkers were obnoxious. Now I know Texans are obnoxious too, and it's taught to them as very little children. Dr. Career Perry, I'm running out of time, but I do want to ask you, advocates, activists, everyday women, just people in general who want to get involved in this fight, what do you suggest they do?
Well, right now we're in the fight, feel like we always say we're in the fight of our lives, but we definitely are at a precipice. We are at a point where the Supreme Court literally might overturn 50 years of legal precedent with one. They already essentially started by not even blocking the Texas case. So supporting your on the ground in the community organizations in Texas, in Mississippi, the folks who have been providing abortion to the patients, to the clients in those communities, that's where we need your support because they are under siege, they are under attack, they are doing the hard work. I have friends who are OBGYNs in Texas who are afraid They're afraid if they have a patient who has a miscarriage, that they will be reported, and a vigilante as a Black doctor will come after them because they are upset with them. So this vigilantism is real. So support the people. We need to be able to have legal funds to support providers and patients in Texas who are under threat of vigilantism.
And Professor Ross, last question for you. We know that Black women are more likely to be targeted than other women. What can women do to protect themselves, and what can people in general do to learn more about the race, the element of race that plays into this abortion fight? Because I don't think many people think of this fight as also being about white supremacy and anti-Blackness. I think people have bought into the notion that this is somehow about, the moral position or about life, as we know it, when does life start? But so help us, where can people go to learn more about the anti-Blackness element of this abortion fight? And then what can Black women who are likely to be targeted do to protect themselves?
Well, I would recommend that they go to the Sister Song website, sistersong.net, that has a project called Trust Black Women that we started when those anti-abortion billboards started appearing in the Black community in 2010 and 2011, claiming that Black women having abortion were committing self-genocide. So that's one place to start. But I also want to say that even within the white feminist movement, there are people who are woke, who understand that they have to use an intersectional analysis in order to fully comprehend what is going on. So I don't want to oversimplify everybody into this narrow white feminist lens, because people don't understand the complexity and the diversity of feminist thinking, not only in the white community, but in the Black community as well. Right. But the best thing to do is to do more research and less me search. Go out there and find out what is actually going on in your community. And the last thing I'll say about it is that this is not 1973. We have knowledge about how to provide abortions for ourselves. We have abortion pills. We have an underground railroad, so to speak, of getting women to the states where they can get their human rights protected. You cannot push us back, no matter how you try. And many of us are willing to put our lives and our careers on the line to ensure that women don't die. That is our commitment that we're making to all these forces of white supremacy. We're going to be the strongest link we can be in this eternal chain of freedom. And this is just our lunch counter moment.
Wow, thank you for that powerful, really incredible. And I'm so glad you brought up those billboards, because you can't drive through a Black community without seeing those billboards trying to play on people's, play on their hearts and their minds, and somehow, convince them with this misinformation that somehow if they exercise their reproductive rights, that they are committing some kind of act against the race. So thank you for bringing that up. Thank you for giving us your website. I just love the work that both you and Dr. Perry are doing. Keep lifting your voices. Keep reminding people that this fight is not going to go away, and we're not going to stop being a part of it. And we'll continue to watch this space and see what happens. But with advocates like you on the front line, I'm more hopeful, I think, than I was after I talked to the attorney. I'm more hopeful that the advocates are going to win the day than the lawyers. And I happen to be a lawyer. So.
That part. That's always been the truth, right?
The people on the ground are going to win this fight for all of us, and women in particular, and women of color in particular. So again, thanks to both of you for sitting down with me this morning.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, we've talked about the legal aspect. We've talked about the moral aspect. Now I want to talk about policy. My next guest is Elisa Spitzer. She is a policy analyst for women's health and rights at the Center for American Progress. Good morning, Elisa. We've been talking a lot about what's going on with the lawsuits, and we know what the advocates on the ground are doing. Help us understand what's happening from a policy standpoint. Is there anything that's moving in the federal system that can prevent this Texas law from denying women their fundamental rights to reproductive health?
Yes, fortunately. So as you have discussed amply on the show so far, the courts have not necessarily been doing their job to step in and protect the rights that have been enshrined in law for 50 years and should continue to be recognized. But because they aren't, it's extra important that Congress take action. So there are two bills that are working their way through Congress. I'll just run through each of those briefly. The first is the Women's Health Protection Act. You might hear it referenced as WIPA. And the second is the Equal Access to Abortion Coverage in Health Insurance Act, referred to as EACH. And WIPA would protect the federal right to abortion and prevent restrictions such as Texas SB 8. And EACH would improve public coverage and access to abortion. So making sure, particularly for people on Medicaid, that abortion is not just a theoretical right, but actually something that is available, which is important. An additional avenue for rights protection beyond what Congress can do is that states can take action. So while Texas is doing atrocious things, other states have indicated that they're interested in following suit, but certain states have also been really proactive, taking measures to affirm that they support the right to abortion, connecting state funds and abortion funds, and trying to make sure that people within their borders actually are definitively able to access this right, even as other states are trying to undermine it.
Given the slim majority that Democrats hold in the House and the Senate, how likely is it that either of these two pieces of federal legislation will get passed?
Well, I think that is a great question. I think that the House is different from the Senate. So I think that, Nancy Pelosi has indicated that she will bring WIPA up for a vote once the House returns. So that could be fantastic, and it very well might pass the House. However, the Senate is a higher barrier. So less optimistic about the Senate, but I think it's still significant that if one of the houses can pass this into law, that would be a significant marker.
And you did mention that states obviously have the right to enact their own laws, and they can go further they can protect women's rights to abortion in the way that Texas is trying to restrict women's rights. What do you think will happen when the Supreme Court takes up, well, we don't know if the Supreme Court will take up the Texas case before the Mississippi case, the Mississippi 15-week ban, which hasn't gone into effect, but the court will hear that case in this session, this court session. But what do you think might happen in some of these states if Roe v. Wade is overturned by this Mississippi case or this Texas case?
Yes, it's not looking so great. It's pretty terrifying. I think that, there is some nuance as to what the court could do in either the Texas case or the Mississippi case. There is a way that they could write an opinion that certainly undermines Roe in that it no longer respects viability as a significant threshold, but that would recognize a right to abortion, say, through 15 weeks. And so the way that the court actually
to be clear for people, Roe now pretty much protects abortion up to about 22 to 24 weeks, right?
Exactly. Yes. The point of viability, which depends on each individual and has to be determined by a doctor.
But that's why it's so important to put in perspective that Roe is protected. Roe in cases that follow Roe protects women up to 24 weeks. And this Mississippi law is trying to reduce that 24 to 15. And then Texas reduces that 24 to 6. And there's nothing that would prevent a state like Texas from even going further than the 6-week ban and just banning abortions altogether.
So exactly. So the way that the Supreme Court decides, they could undermine Roe in the sense of, obliterating the viability threshold, but still indicate some sort of time that is farther along than 6 weeks or farther along than 15 weeks. And, maybe they'll say, Roe has been law and we're going to stick with it. But the actual effect in states will depend actually on how the court writes the opinion. Certainly there are states that say, if it's constitutional, we'll obliterate abortion access entirely. But I hope that that's not how far the court goes.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for your analysis. Obviously, this is a space we're going to be watching very carefully. We're going to watch, as I said at the beginning of the show, we know the DOJ has already filed a request for a temporary injunction at the federal court level in Texas, trying to prevent the law from going into place. Unfortunately, given what the Supreme Court has already, how the Supreme Court has already ruled on that emergency petition filed a couple of weeks ago, I'm not very hopeful that they're going to look at this case differently because the filing now is coming from the DOJ. And it seems like this case is going to have to make its way up back to the Supreme Court for a decision on the merits, which is important to note that there has been no decision on the merits. This has all been, about the procedure. Jurisdiction and venue have been the questions raised at this point. But at some point, the court is going to have to rule on the merits of the 6-week ban. And given the 5-4 conservative court that we have, not very hopeful, a little scary. But thank you for the work that you're doing. We're going to watch this space, see what happens. Those advocates are going to play such an important role. Everyone contacting their senators, their governors, their state legislators, their federal Congress people, and making their voices known. Because one thing we do know is that statistically, overwhelmingly, Americans believe that abortion should be legal in this country. That's so important to note. Again, Elisa, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
I want to thank all of my guests. Abortions are such, conversation around abortions, as we heard Reverend Shade say, can be really dicey, delicate. Oftentimes people go instantly to morality. They talk about the Bible. They talk about viability. They talk about heartbeats. They talk about, even genocide. We've heard Dr. Perry talk about those signs, or Professor Ross, those signs in the Black community that indicted women for having abortions, saying they were committing Black genocide. But we don't hear a lot of talk about the anti-Blackness that is baked into these anti-abortion laws and these anti-abortion advocates. And that's why I'm so grateful to my guests today for really bringing home the point that this isn't just about whether a woman has a baby or not. This is about ensuring that white supremacy and the structures that support white supremacy remain in place. And until we look at abortion laws in that light and recognize that this is a fight for rights of people of color, I think we're going to continue to see these repressive laws like the one in the state of Texas. Just some words to live by before I get out. Our bodies, our choice. The choice to terminate a pregnancy is private, and should never be used to push a political agenda that further marginalizes people, especially Black women. Every year, millions of women who vary in age and marital status and sexual orientation experience unplanned pregnancies. Forcing them to have a baby is a form of forced enslavement. That is why access to safe abortions is so important. It is not and should not be up to state legislators, mostly white men, to dictate to women if they should become parents. If women can be trusted to make decisions on whether to wear a mask or get a COVID-19 vaccine in red states like Texas, they definitely should be trusted with decisions about their own reproductive health. Now, that's what justice is. That's what justice looks like. That's what healthcare is. And that's the only way to ensure that women are equal to men. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Don't forget to wear your mask. And remember, we are all in this together.